Decision: the conflict over fishing and water rights in the state of Washington. Background of the story. As you've previously learned, reliance on salmon was a widespread tradition among Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest. The original residents of Washington did not view land and water as commodities or as property to be sold or traded by private persons. When American settlers arrived, they laid claim to parcels of land and the water, since they didn't think the Native Americans owned these areas. To make room for farms, treaties were forced upon tribes in the 1850s. They were promised to fish and hunt off reservation land in their usual and accustomed grounds and stations. However, because Native Americans were not citizens of the United States until 1924, they weren't permitted to move freely. Reservations became smaller and smaller, and native lands were unprotected. Therefore, the land was sold, and most pledges about fishing and hunting rights were completely ignored. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement that swept across the United States introduced new protest ideas. Native tribes saw this as an opportunity to bring attention to the treaty rights that had been denied them for more than a century. Pacific Northwest tribe members began to nonviolently protest new fishing regulations that limited their traditional customs and originally negotiated fishing rights. Activists planned a protest called a fish-in. It was a twist on the typical sit-ins popular in the South during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Tribe members simply fished the way they traditionally would, which then violated new state fishing regulations. During the 1960s and early 1970s, the fish-ins were led by activists Bob Seshcom, James Young of the Puyallup tribe, and Billy Frank of the Nisqually tribe. In one event, high-profile activist and actor Marlon Brando joined them at a fish-in. Brando was arrested during that demonstration. They and many other Native activists were arrested many times for violating Washington fishing laws. Wardens destroyed their nets, and demonstrators who protested to support Native Americans' fishing rights were tear-gassed by police. The fish-ins and other protests by the American Indian movement in other parts of the U.S. drew attention. The Justice Department filed a lawsuit in 1974 against Washington State for violating treaty rights, a victory for the tribes and their supporters. In what many call the most contested legal decision in Washington state history, federal judge George H. Boldt ruled against Washington state. He determined that half of the state's annual salmon catch should belong to the Native American fishermen because of the years of violated treaty rights. However, this judgment didn't completely resolve the issue. Non-Native fishermen were enraged over the decision and launched protests against Judge Boldt. He also received death threats. In the end, the decision stood, and the commercial fishing had to lessen its take of salmon in Washington rivers. In the end, the Boldt decision put power behind the original treaties that went unrecognized for more than 100 years. Eventually, all parties were reconciled, and the state worked with tribes to restore the Nisqually Delta salmon habitat. Salmon restoration is a new challenge that the entire region must work toward because salmon populations have become depleted over the last century. As activist Billy Frank noted many years after the Boldt decision, it is important that all the people of the Pacific Northwest work together to save the salmon.